Welcome to Mystery Cafe, your ultimate stop for gripping detective stories, chilling mysteries, and unforgettable investigations. Here, every video serves a fresh dose of suspense, shocking twists, and cases that challenge your inner detective. From classic whodunits to modern crime stories, we bring the world of mystery straight to your screen, where every clue matters and no secret stays buried for long. Before we start unraveling today's mystery, we'd love to know, where are you watching from? Globe showing Europe, Africa. Drop your country, city, or stay in the comments, and let's see how far the Mystery Cafe family reaches. Magnifying glass tilted right.
The Shadows of St. Mary's. Chapter 1. The Silent Witness. The quaint town of St. Mary's was normally a peaceful place, known for its cobblestone streets and the sound of church bells ringing every Sunday. But on one fateful morning, something happened that would shatter the tranquility of the village and require the sharp mind of Father Brown. It all began at dawn when a body was found in the small alleyway behind the local bakery. The victim, a man in his late 30s, was discovered by Mrs. Green, the widow who ran the bakery. She had gone out to collect fresh bread from the bakery's delivery cart when she noticed something strange lying near the back door. At first, she thought it was a pile of rubbish, but upon closer inspection she realized it was a man. The man's name, as it would soon be discovered, was Charles Pearson, a wealthy businessman who had recently moved to the village. He was well known for his sharp business acumen and his impressive collection of rare antiques. But this morning he was lying in the cold, lifeless, with a single gunshot wound to the chest. Father Brown was immediately summoned by the local constable, who had little idea how to proceed with such a case. The constable was new to the village and had hoped for an easy assignment, but the presence of a murder had thrown him into disarray. Father Brown arrived at the scene with his usual calm demeanor. His eyes swept over the surroundings, taking in every detail, from the position of the body to the faintest trace of blood leading towards a nearby fence. The alley, although quiet at first glance, held many secrets that only Father Brown's sharp mind could uncover. "Father, thank goodness you're here," the constable said, visibly relieved. Father Brown nodded politely. "It seems we have a tragedy on our hands, Constable. Tell me what you know." The constable explained that Pearson had been shot in the chest at close range, and there were no signs of a struggle. The alley itself was devoid of any immediate suspects, and no one had heard the gunshot. Father Brown bent down to examine the body, his sharp eyes noticing a peculiar detail. There was no sign of the typical confusion and fear one might expect from a person who had been shot. The man's face was strangely serene, almost as though he had known his fate was coming. There were no signs of defensive wounds, which puzzled Father Brown further. The absence of a struggle meant that Pearson had likely known his assailant. But who would want to kill such a well-regarded man? "Do you have any information about his personal life?" Father Brown asked. The constable mentioned that Pearson had been a newcomer to St. Mary's and had made few friends in the village. He had kept mostly to himself, focusing on his work, though it was known that he had a heated argument with a local antique dealer just a few days before his death. Father Brown stood up, his mind already beginning to form a theory. He glanced around the alley, looking for clues that might offer more insight. The gunshot wound, the lack of struggle, and the calm expression on the victim's face all pointed to something deeper than a simple crime of passion. There was something methodical about it, as though the killer had planned it meticulously. "I'd like to speak with the antique dealer," Father Brown said. "Do you know his name?" The constable quickly provided the information. The dealer was a man named Gregory Wells, a man known for his pride and stubbornness, especially when it came to the rarest of artifacts. Father Brown thanked the constable and headed toward the antique shop, his mind racing with possibilities. As he walked through the village, he couldn't help but notice the subtle tension in the air. The streets, which usually buzzed with the sound of cheerful conversations, seemed eerily silent. Everyone knew something was amiss, but no one dared speak openly about it. Upon arriving at the antique shop, Father Brown was greeted by a man with a stern look who introduced himself as Gregory Wells. Wells was a tall, thin man in his early 40s with sharp features that suggested a man who had known hardship. His eyes, however, betrayed his composure, flickering with a brief flash of unease when Father Brown mentioned the murder. "Father, I am not sure why you would want to speak with me about this," Wells said, trying to maintain his calm. "I'm merely following the lead that Mr. Pearson was involved in a dispute with you just a few days ago," Father Brown replied gently. "Perhaps you can shed some light on that?" Wells hesitated, but then his expression softened. "Yes, it's true. We did have an argument. It was over an antique piece he had recently acquired, one I had been after for years. But I swear, Father, I didn't kill him. Our argument was heated, but it was about business, not personal matters." Father Brown listened intently, observing Wells carefully. "And what happened after that argument?" Wells shifted uncomfortably. "Nothing, really. I went back to my shop and continued with my work. I had no reason to harm him. Besides, I have an alibi. I was in my shop all evening and several people can vouch for me." Father Brown's eyes narrowed as he processed the information. It seemed that Wells was telling the truth, but something didn't quite add up. The argument might have been heated, but it didn't seem like a motive for murder. "Thank you, Mr. Wells. I'll let you know if I need any further information," Father Brown said, before leaving the shop. As Father Brown walked back to the church, he thought about what he had learned so far. The argument over the antique was certainly a lead, but it didn't seem to explain the cold-blooded nature of the murder. It was as if the killer had been driven by something deeper, something personal. Father Brown knew that this was only the beginning of the mystery. There were more pieces to uncover, and he was determined to find them, no matter how long it took. Chapter 2. The Hidden Clue. The day after Father Brown's conversation with Gregory Wells, the investigation into Charles Pearson's murder took a twist. The early morning sun cast long shadows over St. Mary's as Father Brown sat in the quiet church office, reflecting on the events of the previous day. The village had grown unusually quiet in the wake of Pearson's death. The peaceful aura that once hung over the cobblestone streets now felt strained, as though everyone was waiting for the storm to break. Father Brown had learned enough to know that he was dealing with a puzzle that required patience and observation. His experience told him that this case wasn't a simple affair of a business dispute gone wrong. There were layers to the crime that he would have to peel back one by one. He had already visited Gregory Wells, and while the man seemed genuine in his denial of involvement, there were still too many unanswered questions. The argument over the antique had been real, but Father Brown wasn't convinced that it had led to murder. Wells seemed more worried about his reputation than any real animosity toward Pearson. The fact that he had a solid alibi only complicated things further. As Father Brown turned to leave his office, he was interrupted by a sudden knock on the door. He looked up to see Mrs. Green, the bakery owner, standing in the doorway, her face pale and anxious. She had been the one to discover Pearson's body in the alley, and Father Brown had a sense that there was something more to her involvement in this case than she had let on. "Father Brown, I need to speak with you," Mrs. Green said, her voice trembling. "There's something I forgot to tell you. Something important." Father Brown's eyes softened. "Please, come in, Mrs. Green. What's troubling you?" She sat down across from him and took a deep breath. I didn't want to get involved, but now I think I have no choice. There was something strange about the way I found Mr. Pearson's body. It's not just that he was dead, it's what I saw before I found him. Father Brown leaned forward, intrigued. What do you mean? I was out back, collecting the bread from the delivery cart, when I noticed a shadow near the alley. It was too early for anyone to be out there, but when I looked closer, I saw a figure standing in the alley. It was a man, but I couldn't see his face. He was dressed in dark clothes, and he was holding something shiny. Father Brown's mind immediately began to race. A figure in dark clothes holding something shiny. It could have been a weapon, but it could also be something else entirely. "Did you recognize the man?" he asked. Mrs. Green shook her head. "No, I didn't see his face clearly enough. He turned and disappeared into the shadows before I could get a good look. I thought I was imagining things, but now I think maybe it was the killer." Father Brown's thoughts began to form a clearer picture. The figure Mrs. Green had seen could very well have been the murderer. But why had they been lurking there? And what had they been holding? The fact that Mrs. Green hadn't mentioned this detail earlier troubled him, but he couldn't afford to waste time with questions now. This could be the breakthrough he needed. "Did anyone else see this man?" Father Brown inquired. Mrs. Green looked uneasy. "Not that I know of." "I was alone when I found the body." "Very well. Thank you for sharing this, Mrs. Green. It may be the key to solving this case," Father Brown said gently. "I'll look into it further." As she left, Father Brown mulled over the information. A shadowy figure in the alley holding something shiny. There were too many possibilities. He needed to investigate this further and find out whether the mysterious figure had any connection to Pearson's death. The next step in his investigation was to visit the scene again. He needed to study the alley and the surrounding area with a fresh set of eyes. There was no such thing as a small detail when it came to solving a murder, and Father Brown knew that the smallest clue could unlock the entire mystery. By midday, Father Brown arrived at the alley behind the bakery. The area was quiet now, with only a few birds chirping in the distance. The cold air had cleared away any lingering traces of the night before, but Father Brown could still feel the weight of the murder in the atmosphere. The alley, though narrow, had a peculiar stillness that set Father Brown's nerves on edge. He walked slowly down the alley, taking in every inch of the surroundings. There was the door to the bakery where Mrs. Green had found the body. To the right was a narrow wooden fence, and beyond that, a line of small cottages. To the left, the alley led into a small courtyard where a few forgotten barrels stood. Father Brown bent down and examined the ground near where Pearson's body had been found. He noticed a faint impression in the dirt, small but distinct, as though something had been dropped or kicked. Crouching down, Father Brown gently traced the outline with his finger. There, lying half buried in the dirt, was a small silver coin. It wasn't much, but it was something. He picked it up carefully, feeling its weight in his palm. It was a rare coin, one that Father Brown had seen before. He had seen it in Gregory Wells's antique shop just days ago. It was a part of a set of coins that had once belonged to an ancient Roman emperor. Father Brown's heart quickened. This was no ordinary coin. It was a clue, and it was pointing him straight to Gregory Wells. The connection between Pearson and Wells was becoming clearer. Pearson had been interested in rare antiques, and it was clear that he had been involved with Wells in some way. But why had Pearson been murdered? Was it over a coin, or was there something else at play? Father Brown stood up, feeling more certain than ever that he was on the right track. He needed to confront Gregory Wells and find out what he knew about the coin. There was no time to waste. The murder of Charles Pearson had just become more complicated, and Father Brown was determined to unravel the mystery no matter how deep it went. Chapter 3. The Antique Dealer's Secrets. Father Brown had long ago learned that when investigating a crime, the pursuit of truth often meant sifting through layers of deception, half-truths and omissions. Gregory Wells, the local antique dealer, seemed like a man with nothing to hide, but Father Brown's instincts were telling him otherwise. The silver coin he had discovered in the alley behind the bakery had sealed his suspicions. Wells was more involved in Charles Pearson's death than he had first let on. As Father Brown approached the antique shop, he took a moment to study the building. It was an unassuming structure on the edge of St. Mary's, with weathered wooden shutters and an assortment of curios displayed in the window. The shop had the air of an old-world establishment, filled with history and artifacts from forgotten times. But to Father Brown, the dust on the shelves and the faint smell of antique wood seemed to obscure something darker. He had no doubt now that something valuable had been lost or stolen within these walls. Father Brown entered the shop, the bell above the door chiming softly. Inside, the atmosphere was even more heavy with the weight of history. Shelves lined with items of various age and origin were stacked haphazardly. There were ancient paintings, tarnished silverware, and rows of rare coins, some sealed in glass display cases. Gregory Wells was behind the counter, polishing an old brass candlestick with an oiled cloth. "Ah, Father Brown," Wells said with a tight smile, his voice somewhat strained. "I wasn't expecting you again so soon. What can I do for you?" Father Brown nodded in greeting, his eyes scanning the shop carefully. "I've come to speak with you about something I found," he said, his voice measured and calm. "A coin, a rare silver coin, in fact. I believe you'll recognize it." Wells froze for a moment, his hand still on the candlestick, before he set it down slowly. His eyes flickered with the briefest hint of fear, but he quickly masked it with a forced composure. "A coin, you say?" Wells replied, feigning indifference. "I can't say I recall a coin like that." Father Brown's sharp gaze never left him. "I believe you do, Mr. Wells," he said softly. "It's part of a set that you have in your shop, a collection from the reign of Emperor Valerian. I've seen it myself. So tell me, why would this coin be found near the scene of Charles Pearson's murder?" Wells's face darkened, and for a moment he seemed lost in thought. "I don't know what you're implying, Father. I don't see how my shop or my coins could have anything to do with Mr. Pearson's death." Father Brown didn't flinch at Wells's denial. He knew better than to take things at face value. "I'll admit, the connection is not immediately obvious, but the presence of the coin, Mr. Wells, suggests a deeper involvement. Pearson was a man of wealth, and he had an eye for rare antiques, but why would he be found dead in a back alley with a coin from your shop? I must ask, what exactly was your relationship with him?" Wells's expression darkened further, but his voice remained steady. "Mr. Pearson and I had a professional relationship, nothing more. He was a collector and I was a dealer. He'd come by every now and then to purchase items for his collection. There was no bad blood between us. He bought some of my finest pieces, including that coin." Father Brown's mind raced. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but there were still too many gaps. Pearson's murder hadn't been a random act of violence, it had been deliberate. The killer had planned this, and now it seemed that Wells might have been more than just a bystander. "And was Mr. Pearson your only customer?" Father Brown asked, his voice gentle but probing. "Was he the only one interested in your collection?" Wells stiffened, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I've had many customers over the years, Father. Some are more regular than others. But that's business. There's nothing sinister about it." But there is something you're not telling me, isn't there? Mr. Wells, Father Brown said, his eyes narrowing. You see, there's one more thing I noticed when I was in your shop. You're missing a coin from that set, one that I've seen on display in the past. Tell me, Mr. Wells, where is it? Wells hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the line of questioning. He shifted on his feet, his gaze darting around the shop as though searching for an escape. I don't know what you're talking about, he muttered. Father Brown took a step closer to the counter, his presence commanding. I think you do. That coin isn't just a trinket, Mr. Wells. It's a piece of something much larger. Charles Pearson's death may have been the result of an obsession, a collector's obsession. I think you and Pearson were more involved than you let on. Perhaps he wanted something you weren't willing to part with. Wells's face turned pale, and he looked away, clearly torn between his desire to maintain control and the growing realization that Father Brown was closing in on the truth. After a long pause, he finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't mean for it to happen, Father, he said, his shoulders slumping with defeat. I didn't want it to come to this. Father Brown's heart sank, but his mind remained sharp. What happened, Mr. Wells? Wells looked up at him, his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and regret. Pearson had become obsessed with that coin, the one you're talking about. It was the last one in the set, and he wanted it badly, but it wasn't for sale. It wasn't something I was willing to part with. Not for any price. Father Brown raised an eyebrow, sensing that the story was about to take a darker turn. Go on. I was saving it for a special occasion, Father. It was worth a fortune, more than Pearson could ever imagine, Wells confessed. But he wouldn't take no for an answer. He insisted on having it, and he started threatening me. He said he'd ruin my business if I didn't sell it to him. Father Brown's suspicion was confirmed. Pearson's death wasn't a random act of violence. It had been the result of an escalating conflict over the antique coin. But there was more to it than that. And when did the argument turn deadly? Father Brown asked softly. Wells swallowed hard, his face twisted in guilt. It happened the night before he was found dead. I finally gave in, Father. I agreed to sell him the coin, but when he came by to collect it, he was furious. He said I was trying to cheat him, that he had spent more than enough on my other pieces. He grabbed the coin from the counter, and I tried to stop him. I didn't mean to hurt him, Father. I only wanted to scare him to make him understand. But then he turned on me. He threatened me, Father. He said he'd go to the authorities and say I sold him a fake. I just couldn't let him ruin me. Father Brown's heart ached for the man standing before him, but there was no excusing murder. And that's when you killed him? Wells nodded, his eyes downcast. I didn't plan it. It just happened. I grabbed a gun from the back room. I didn't think it would go that far, but in the heat of the moment I shot him. Father Brown stood in stunned silence. The murder had been the result of fear and desperation, not premeditated malice, but that didn't make it any less tragic. Mr. Wells, you've confessed to the crime, Father Brown said softly. But there are still questions that remain. You need to make things right. It's the only way to find peace. Chapter 4. The Burden of Guilt. The confession hung in the air like a heavy fog, and Father Brown stood quietly, his thoughts racing. Gregory Wells had finally admitted to the crime, but there was more to the story than the dealer's words conveyed. Murder was never the result of a single moment of weakness, no matter how desperate the circumstances. Father Brown knew that something deeper was at play, something more than the argument over a rare coin. Wells slumped against the counter, his hands trembling as they gripped the edge. The weight of his admission seemed to have crushed any remaining resolve in him. Father Brown studied the man who, until just a moment ago, had appeared composed and in control. Now, Wells looked nothing like the confident antique dealer he had once been. The truth had torn him apart. "Mr. Wells," Father Brown began gently, his voice calm and measured, "you've confessed to killing Charles Pearson. But what I don't understand is why you didn't simply walk away. Why didn't you go to the authorities the moment things got out of hand?" Wells glanced up, his eyes filled with a mixture of shame and fear. "I couldn't, Father," he whispered. "If I had gone to the authorities, my life would have been over. I'd lose my business, my reputation. Pearson was a powerful man, and he had enough influence to ruin me. He made sure I knew that. I was backed into a corner, and in that moment, I thought I had no other choice." Father Brown's mind raced. Wells's fear had driven him to murder, but what had truly pushed him over the edge? There had to be more. Pearson had been a wealthy man, but Father Brown sensed that there was something darker, something more personal about their relationship that Wells hadn't fully revealed. "You've told me about the coin," Father Brown continued, "but I still don't understand why Pearson was so insistent. A rare coin may be valuable, but it doesn't justify murder. Tell me, was there something else Pearson wanted from you? Something beyond the coin?" Wells's eyes widened, and he let out a long, shuddering breath. He looked around the shop, as if searching for some form of solace in the familiar surroundings. "He was obsessed with me," Wells finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "At first, it was just business. But then he started showing up more and more often, wanting to spend time with me. He would compliment me, flatter me, act as though he was my friend. But I knew better. I could see through his mask." Father Brown's heart sank. "You mean to say that Pearson was more than just a customer to you?" Wells nodded grimly. "He wanted more. He wanted me. And when I started rejecting his advances, he became possessive. It was like he was trying to control me, Father. He was a manipulator. At first, I thought it was just harmless flirting, but as time went on, it became something else. He wanted me to be his business partner, his companion, maybe even something more. And when I refused, he started threatening me in more subtle ways. He said he could ruin me, that he could destroy everything I had worked for." Father Brown's suspicions were confirmed. Pearson had been more than just a wealthy collector. He had been a predator, using his power and influence to coerce Wells. It wasn't just about money or status, it was about control. Pearson had tried to dominate Wells, and when his advances were rejected, he resorted to intimidation. Wells had been trapped, caught in a web of manipulation that had only tightened over time. "I see," Father Brown said quietly, his mind processing the gravity of the situation. "But that still doesn't explain why you didn't walk away, Mr. Wells. You could have moved away, left St. Mary's behind, and started anew. Why did you let Pearson's threats control you so completely?" Wells shook his head in frustration. "I didn't have the strength, Father. I wasn't strong enough to fight him off. He had the power, the wealth, the connections. I was just a small-town antique dealer. No one would believe me if I went to the authorities. Pearson was well liked in the village. People admired him. No one would have taken me seriously. I had no choice but to comply, and the more I complied, the more he wanted." Father Brown watched Wells carefully. It was clear that the dealer was not only burdened by guilt, but also by fear. Fear of the consequences of speaking the truth, fear of being exposed as the victim of a powerful and dangerous man. Pearson had manipulated Wells into a position where the only way out seemed to be silence and submission. "I understand, Mr. Wells," Father Brown said, his voice calm but firm. "But your confession is only the first step. You must take responsibility for your actions, not only to redeem yourself, but also to bring closure to this tragic chapter in your life." Wells looked up, his eyes filled with tears. "I didn't mean to kill him, Father. I didn't want to take a life. But in that moment, I didn't know what else to do. I tried to warn him, to tell him to leave me alone, but he wouldn't stop. And then he was just there, holding the coin in his hand, accusing me of trying to cheat him. He pushed me too far. I didn't know what came over me. I grabbed the gun, and before I knew it, I had pulled the trigger." Father Brown stood silent for a moment, contemplating the complexity of the situation. Wells's confession had peeled back the layers of fear and guilt, but it didn't absolve him of his crime. Father Brown knew that justice needed to be served, not only for Pearson, but also for Wells. There was a fine line between redemption and punishment, and Wells was teetering on that edge. "You need to come with me, Mr. Wells," Father Brown said after a long pause. "It's time to make things right. The authorities must know the truth, and the people of St. Mary's deserve closure. You've carried this burden long enough." Wells nodded slowly, his shoulders shaking as he rose from the counter. "I know, Father. I've been living with this guilt for so long. I'll go. I'll face whatever comes." Father Brown led him outside, where the quiet village of St. Mary's seemed to hold its breath as if awaiting the resolution of a dark and complicated chapter. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows over the town, and Father Brown knew that although this case was far from over, it was the beginning of something new, a path toward redemption for a man who had long been trapped by fear, guilt, and the grip of manipulation. Chapter 5. The Final Piece. The following days after Gregory Wells's confession were a blur for Father Brown. The antique dealer, despite his initial reluctance, had been taken into custody by the local constable. His fate now rested in the hands of the law, but Father Brown knew the truth about the events leading up to Charles Pearson's death. However, as he sat in his small office at the church, a nagging feeling lingered. Wells had confessed to the murder, but something didn't sit right. Pearson had been a man who could command influence with a mere word, but he was also cunning. There were still questions left unanswered, questions that until now had been overshadowed by the tragic nature of the crime. Father Brown leaned back in his chair, his mind sharp with the details he had gathered over the course of the investigation. Wells's confession had been raw and real, but it had also been shaped by fear and guilt. Pearson had been a manipulator, yes, but there was a deeper element to their dynamic, something that had driven Pearson to such extremes, and Father Brown was certain that if he could uncover the last piece of the puzzle, he would understand what had truly led to Pearson's death. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. "Father Brown?" It was Constable Richards, his face pale and troubled. "We've received new information. I think you'll want to see this." Father Brown stood up immediately, his interest piqued. "What is it, Constable?" Richards handed him a sealed envelope, its contents thick and official-looking. "We found something, Father. Something Pearson left behind, and we need your help to understand it." Father Brown carefully opened the envelope and retrieved a series of papers. As he scanned through them, his eyes narrowed. They were pages from a ledger, each entry detailing financial transactions. But these weren't ordinary records. The dates and figures seemed to correlate with Pearson's dealings with Wells, but there was one entry that caught Father Brown's attention. A large sum of money transferred from Pearson's account to an unknown name. The payment had been made only a day before the murder. "Who is this?" Father Brown asked, holding up the page with the mysterious name. Richards peered at the paper. "We don't know yet, Father. It's not a name we recognize, but we're looking into it." Father Brown's mind raced. The sum of money, the mysterious name. It was clear that Pearson had been involved in something deeper than just his obsession with rare antiques. There had been a deal, a financial transaction, and Pearson had been involved with someone else. The details in the ledger hinted at a network of shady business dealings that stretched far beyond Wells. "Find out who this is," Father Brown instructed, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "This could be the breakthrough we need." As Constable Richards left to pursue this new lead, Father Brown remained behind in the quiet office, turning over the information in his mind. Pearson's death had never felt like an isolated incident. The financial transactions pointed to a more extensive scheme, a web of deceit that Pearson had been tangled in. But what was the connection to Wells? Father Brown suspected that Wells had been nothing more than a pawn in a much larger game. Someone else had been pulling the strings, and Pearson's death might have been the final act in a much bigger play. A few hours later, Constable Richards returned, this time with the answers Father Brown had been waiting for. "We found the name," Richards said breathlessly. "It's a man named Edwin Lawson. He's a known figure in the world of illegal antiquities trading. He's been under investigation for years, but he's always managed to stay just under the radar. We believe Pearson had been involved with him for some time." Father Brown's suspicions had been correct. Pearson's obsession with rare antiques, combined with his increasingly erratic behavior, was a result of his involvement with Lawson. The deal that had gone sour had likely been the catalyst for Pearson's murder. Pearson had tried to cut ties with Lawson, but in doing so, he had sealed his own fate. "That explains everything," Father Brown said softly. Pearson had been dealing in stolen antiquities. He had gotten himself involved in a criminal network, and Wells was just a small part of it. Wells was pressured into compliance, but Pearson had made a fatal mistake. He tried to back out, and Lawson wasn't willing to let him go so easily. Richards looked puzzled. But why would Wells kill Pearson if he wasn't the mastermind? Father Brown's gaze hardened as he considered the implications. Wells may not have been the mastermind, but he had a personal stake in this. Pearson had manipulated him, using threats to control him. But Pearson wasn't just a collector, he was involved in something darker. When Wells realized the full extent of Pearson's crimes, he must have felt trapped, as if he had no choice but to end it. Father Brown paused, staring out the window at the village below. Wells wasn't a cold-blooded killer. He acted out of fear and desperation. But the truth is, Pearson had been playing a dangerous game, and he paid the price for it. The investigation had taken a surprising turn. Father Brown now understood the true nature of Pearson's death. It was not just a result of an antique dispute, it was a consequence of a dangerous world of illegal trading and criminal enterprises. Pearson had been caught in a web of deceit, and when he tried to pull away, it cost him his life. Father Brown stood up, feeling the weight of the case lift slightly. The truth was clearer now, but there were still many questions left unanswered. What would happen to Wells? What would happen to Lawson? And how much of Pearson's criminal activities had remained hidden from the village? "I need to speak with Wells again," Father Brown said, his mind already racing toward the next step. "There's more to this story. He may not have been the true culprit, but there are still pieces we haven't uncovered. It's time to finish what we started." Chapter 6. The Unraveling Web. The days that followed the discovery of Edwin Lawson's involvement were heavy with both anticipation and dread. Father Brown had always known that the path to truth would be complicated, but he had never anticipated that the case would unearth such a tangled web of deceit, manipulation, and criminality. The discovery of Pearson's dealings with Lawson, a notorious figure in the underground world of illegal antiquities trading, had changed everything. What had begun as a simple murder investigation had now transformed into something far more sinister. Father Brown sat in his office, the weight of the case pressing down on him. He had spoken to Wells once more, but the dealer had been inconsolable. The fear and guilt that had driven him to murder Pearson had been compounded by the revelation of Pearson's true nature. Wells, despite his confession, had been just another victim in a much larger scheme. The news of Lawson's involvement had shaken him, but it had also provided some clarity. Pearson had been a man trapped by his own obsessions, and his dealings with Lawson had pushed him to the brink. As Father Brown pondered the details, his thoughts kept returning to Lawson. The man had managed to avoid the authorities for years, operating in the shadows and pulling the strings of a criminal network. Pearson's death had been a result of his attempt to extricate himself from that world, but the question remained, why had Lawson been willing to let Pearson go? Surely Pearson had something valuable, something that Lawson couldn't afford to lose. And yet Pearson had tried to sever ties, and that had cost him his life. Father Brown's contemplation was interrupted by a knock on the door. It was Constable Richards, his face grim and filled with urgency. "Father Brown," Richards said, his voice tight. "We've found Lawson. He's in the village." Father Brown's heart skipped a beat. "Where is he now?" Richards lowered his voice. "We've traced him to an abandoned building on the outskirts of St. Mary's. He's holed up there with a few of his associates. We've tried to approach, but he's holding up inside. We need your help, Father." Father Brown stood, his mind racing. This was the moment they had been waiting for. Lawson was the key to everything, the one who had manipulated Pearson, the one who had orchestrated the whole series of events. But now Lawson was cornered. He was desperate, and desperation made people dangerous. "I'll go with you," Father Brown said calmly. "But we must be cautious. Lawson knows we're after him, and he won't hesitate to fight back. This is not just about the murder anymore. It's about uncovering the full extent of the network Pearson was involved in." The two men made their way to the abandoned building, the air thick with tension. Father Brown's thoughts were a whirlwind as they approached. Lawson wasn't just a criminal. He was the mastermind behind a much larger operation. Pearson had been only a small part of it, and Wells, although guilty of murder, had been a pawn caught in the crossfire. But if Father Brown was right, Lawson's involvement didn't end with Pearson's death. He had likely orchestrated the murder to cover up something far larger. As they approached the building, Father Brown could see the faint outline of figures moving behind the dusty windows. There were men inside, watching for any signs of trouble. Lawson's associates, criminals who had worked with him for years, were likely guarding him, ready to protect their interests at any cost. Father Brown and Richards cautiously made their way toward the back entrance, staying out of sight. Father Brown's mind was focused, his every sense alert. He knew that this was their only chance to catch Lawson and bring an end to the dangerous network that had been operating under the village's nose. But it wouldn't be easy. Lawson was a master manipulator, and he would have planned for every contingency. When they reached the back of the building, Richards motioned for Father Brown to follow him. They crept inside, careful not to make a sound. The musty air inside was thick with the scent of decay, and the silence was oppressive. The building was eerily empty, but Father Brown could feel the tension in the air, as though something dark and dangerous was waiting just around the corner. They made their way through the corridors, the faint sounds of movement growing louder. Richard signaled for Father Brown to stop, and they both pressed themselves against the wall. Through a crack in the door, Father Brown could see the flickering light of a fire casting shadows on the walls. Lawson was inside, his back to them, surrounded by several of his associates. Father Brown took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew they had to act fast. If Lawson got away, it would be nearly impossible to track him down again. He turned to Richards and whispered, "I'll create a distraction. You go around and try to get behind him. We'll corner him." Richards nodded, his face set in determination. The plan was risky, but it was the best chance they had. With a quick movement, Father Brown stepped into the open, catching Lawson's attention. "Edwin Lawson," Father Brown called out, his voice calm but firm. "You're surrounded. There's no escape." For a moment, everything was still. Then Lawson turned slowly, a sly smile creeping across his face. "Ah, Father Brown," he said, his voice dripping with mock amusement. "I've been expecting you. Did you think you could stop me? You've already caught one of my pawns, but I'm far from finished." Father Brown's eyes narrowed. "This isn't about pawns anymore, Lawson. This is about you. Your empire of lies is crumbling, and it's time you faced the consequences of your actions." Lawson's smile faded, and for a brief moment, Father Brown saw something else in his eyes. Fear. Lawson knew he was cornered, but he wouldn't go down without a fight. "You're wrong, Father," Lawson spat. "This isn't over. You can't stop what's already in motion." Before Father Brown could respond, Lawson's associates moved toward him, weapons drawn, but Richards was already behind them, and with one swift move, he disarmed the closest man, sending him crashing to the ground. Father Brown stepped forward, his presence commanding, his voice firm. "You've nowhere to run, Lawson. Your network ends here." Lawson hesitated, then made a desperate move toward the back door, but he was too slow. Richards blocked his path, and in a moment, Lawson was on the ground, restrained by the constable. "It's over, Lawson," Father Brown said softly. "Your reign of manipulation and violence ends here." As Lawson was taken away, Father Brown allowed himself a brief moment of relief. The web of lies and corruption had finally unraveled, and the truth was out. Pearson's death had been the catalyst for exposing the darkness that had been festering in St. Mary's for far too long. And though the path had been fraught with danger, Father Brown knew that justice had finally been served. Chapter 7. The Price of Truth. The days following the capture of Edwin Lawson were filled with a mixture of relief and sorrow for the people of St. Mary's. The village, which had once felt serene and unassuming, now buzzed with the echoes of a dark chapter in its history. Father Brown knew that the events surrounding Charles Pearson's death would linger in the minds of the townsfolk for years to come, but there was also a sense that the village could finally begin to heal. The truth, as painful as it had been revealed. But for Father Brown, there was still much to process. While the mystery had been solved, the personal cost of uncovering that truth weighed heavily on him. It had been a week since Lawson's arrest, and Father Brown had spent most of his time in quiet reflection. The case had unfolded in ways he hadn't anticipated. Gregory Wells, once a suspect in Pearson's death, had been cleared of the most serious charges, but the guilt of murder still weighed heavily on him. The man had been trapped in a world of fear and manipulation, and though he had acted out of self-preservation, he had taken a life, something that could never be undone. Father Brown knew Wells would have to face the consequences of his actions, but he also believed that the man's true punishment lay not in a prison sentence, but in the burden of his own conscience. The news of Lawson's arrest had spread quickly through the village, but there were still lingering questions in the air. Pearson's death had been a result of a conflict over rare antiques, yes, but the far-reaching consequences of Pearson's criminal dealings had cast a shadow over the entire investigation. Lawson's network, built on stolen artifacts and black market deals, had been far more extensive than anyone could have imagined. Pearson, it seemed, had been a pawn in Lawson's larger game, a game that had cost him his life. Father Brown's thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door of his small office in the church. He looked up to see Constable Richard standing in the doorway, a grim expression on his face. "Father, I have news," Richard said, stepping inside. "There's been a development regarding Lawson's associates." Father Brown raised an eyebrow. "What kind of development?" "It seems Lawson's network wasn't as contained as we thought," Richards continued, his voice steady but tinged with concern. "We've been able to track down several of his associates, but there's still a handful of people who are unaccounted for. They've scattered, gone underground. We're still trying to track them down." Father Brown leaned back in his chair, considering the information. Lawson's arrest had brought down the head of the operation, but the network of criminals he had been part of had not yet been fully dismantled. The idea of lingering threats, people who were still out there, bothered Father Brown more than he let on. The village may have been safer now, but the shadows of the past weren't so easily erased. "Do we know who these remaining associates are?" Father Brown asked. Richards nodded. "We have a few names, but most of them are connected to other areas of illegal activity. There are whispers of larger criminal ties beyond just Antiquities. Some are rumored to have connections to more dangerous factions. We're still piecing everything together." Father Brown's thoughts raced as he processed the information. If Lawson's associates were still on the run, then the village wasn't as safe as it seemed. There was still work to be done, work that extended beyond merely solving Pearson's murder. There was a wider web of corruption, and as long as even one thread remained uncut, the danger wasn't over. "We need to find them," Father Brown said, his voice resolute. "If these people are as connected as we think, then they pose a danger to everyone in this village. The truth about Pearson's death may be out, but the rest of the story hasn't been told yet." Richards nodded in agreement, but there was a look of doubt in his eyes. "I don't know if we can track down everyone, Father. Some of these people are well hidden, and they know how to cover their tracks. We're doing what we can, but it might take time." Father Brown stood and walked to the window, his gaze falling on the peaceful streets of St. Mary's. It seemed impossible that such a quiet town had been the epicenter of such darkness. But that was the nature of evil. It often thrived in the shadows, hiding in plain sight until it was too late. "I understand, Constable," Father Brown said, his voice calm but filled with determination. "But we cannot let fear or uncertainty dictate our actions. We must stay vigilant, and we must make sure that no one else becomes a victim." The constable nodded, though the weight of the task ahead was clear in his eyes. "You're right, Father. We'll keep searching." As Richards left the room, Father Brown turned back to the window, deep in thought. His role in this investigation was far from over. Pearson's murder had been the catalyst for uncovering a vast criminal network, but it had also opened his eyes to something more profound, the lengths to which people would go to protect their own interests, the power of fear, and the fragility of trust. Wells, Lawson, Pearson, all had been caught in a deadly game, one that had ended in violence and loss. But there was something else that troubled Father Brown. Wells had confessed to the murder, but it wasn't simply a crime of passion or greed. It was a crime born out of desperation. Wells had been caught between two forces, his own conscience and the fear of retribution from Pearson. When Pearson had crossed the line, trying to manipulate Wells further, it had pushed him to act out of sheer panic. Father Brown had seen it in his eyes. Wells wasn't a villain, but a man who had been driven to extremes by circumstances far beyond his control. Father Brown sighed and walked over to his desk, where he had kept a journal of the case. He opened it, his eyes scanning the notes he had made throughout the investigation. As he reflected on the steps that had led them to this point, he realized that the real cost of this case was not simply the loss of life, but the moral consequences of the choices made by those involved. Pearson's ambition Lawson's manipulation, and Wells' fear, they were all intertwined, creating a chain of events that had spiraled out of control. For a moment, Father Brown allowed himself to feel the weight of it all. He had uncovered the truth, but it hadn't brought the sense of closure he had hoped for. The villagers might feel safer knowing the criminals were in custody, but Father Brown knew better. The damage had already been done, and the scars would remain long after the criminals had been locked away. But Father Brown also knew that the truth, though painful, was the only way forward. It was the only way to heal, to break free from the darkness that had threatened to consume the village. And as long as he was there, he would continue to seek the truth, no matter where it led. Chapter 8. The Weight of Redemption. The days turned into weeks, and as time passed, Father Brown's thoughts continued to return to the case that had shaken the very foundations of St. Mary's. The village, though outwardly calm once again, had been irrevocably changed. The events surrounding Charles Pearson's death, Edwin Lawson's criminal empire, and Gregory Wells's involvement had left a deep mark on the town and its people. While some had found solace in the resolution of the case, others remained wary, their trust in their neighbours shattered. But for Father Brown, the work wasn't finished. Not yet. Wells, though granted a lesser sentence due to his cooperation, had been deeply affected by the weight of his actions. The remorse he carried had not been easily erased, and, despite his freedom, Father Brown knew that Wells's inner turmoil would continue for years to come. He had taken a life, yes, but his crime had been one driven by fear and self-preservation. The moral complexities of his decision were not something that could be easily distilled into black and white justice. Father Brown had made it his mission to visit Wells regularly, not as an investigator, but as a friend, as someone who understood the heavy burden of guilt. The dealer was living a quiet life now, far removed from the dangerous world of antique dealings and criminal networks. But his internal struggle was far from over. Wells had taken the first step toward redemption by confessing, but the path ahead would be long and filled with doubts. Father Brown found himself, too, at a crossroads. The case was solved, but the moral questions it raised were more complicated than he had anticipated. What was justice? What was redemption? Could someone truly change after committing a heinous act? Or were they forever marked by the choices they had made? It was a quiet afternoon when Father Brown received an unexpected visitor. He was in his office, organizing his notes from the investigation, when he heard a soft knock on the door. He looked up to see a familiar face, Mrs. Green, the widow who had first discovered Pearson's body. She had been a peripheral figure in the investigation, but her role in the case had not gone unnoticed. She had been the one to spot the figure in the alley, the one to give Father Brown the crucial first clue. "Father," Mrs. Green said softly, stepping into the room, "I need to speak with you." Father Brown smiled warmly, gesturing for her to sit. "Of course, Mrs. Green. What's on your mind?" Mrs. Green hesitated before taking a seat. There was a tremor in her voice, a quiet sadness that Father Brown immediately noticed. "I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened," she began, "about Pearson, about Gregory Wells, about the things I didn't know at the time. I was so shocked by the murder that I didn't stop to think about what led to it. But now I understand more. I see that it wasn't just a random act. There were people involved and there were choices made." Father Brown nodded. "You're right. Pearson's death wasn't just the result of a single argument. It was the culmination of a series of events, of people pushed to their limits." Mrs. Green's eyes met his, and for a moment there was a shared understanding between them. "I've always thought of myself as a good person, Father," she said quietly. "But now I see that I didn't do enough. I didn't see what was happening in front of me. Pearson wasn't just a customer at my bakery. He was a man whose actions hurt others. And I didn't see that until it was too late. Father Brown reached across the desk and gently placed his hand over hers. None of us can see everything, Mrs. Green. We can only do the best we can with the knowledge we have at the time. But you're right about one thing. The past is never easy to face. And it's not always enough to simply acknowledge the wrongs that were done. Sometimes the hardest part is learning how to live with what we've learned and how to make peace with the past. Mrs. Green took a deep breath, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I don't know how to do that, Father. How can I make up for what I didn't see? How do I make things right? Father Brown gave her a soft smile, a rare glimpse of the compassion that guided his every action. The first step is already behind you, Mrs. Green. You're facing the truth, and that is not something everyone is able to do. The next step is finding forgiveness, both for yourself and for those who have wronged you. She nodded slowly, absorbing his words. I've been trying, Father, but I don't know if I can ever really forgive myself. You will, Father Brown said confidently. Forgiveness is a process. It takes time, but remember this, it's not about erasing the past, it's about learning from it, growing from it. You've been given a second chance, just as Wells has. And while it may not undo the damage that was done, it can bring peace. That's the gift of redemption. The conversation drifted on, with Mrs. Green finding solace in Father Brown's quiet wisdom. But as they spoke, Father Brown couldn't help but reflect on how the people of St. Mary's had been forever changed by these events. Wells, Mrs. Green, even Pearson himself, they were all caught in the current of choices, some made out of love, some out of fear, and some out of desperation. But in the end, it was the truth that had brought them to this moment. Later that day, as Father Brown walked through the village, the familiar sights of St. Mary's took on a new meaning. The cobblestone streets, the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze, the distant chime of the church bells. Everything seemed different. The peace that had once felt fragile now seemed earned, as though the village had faced its darkest moments and come out stronger on the other side. Father Brown's gaze turned to the horizon, where the setting sun cast a golden glow over the village. He knew that the work of redemption was never easy, but it was the most important work a person could do. And in that moment, he felt a quiet peace within himself, a sense that no matter the darkness that had come before, there was always hope for a new beginning. As he continued his walk, Father Brown felt a renewed sense of purpose. The case was over, but the journey of redemption was one that never truly ended, and he would continue to guide those who sought the truth, no matter where it led.